Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christensen. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kashaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
So lectins, no doubt you've heard about them, but there's been a lot of confusion. Are they really dangerous? Which ones might be, which ones might not? What do you do about the fact that some of the high lectin foods are foods that might otherwise be healthy? So to have a deep discussion on lectins, I brought in Dr. David Katz. He's been a great author for quite some time. I've followed his work. In '98, he founded the Yale University's Preventive Research Center. He's got a strong background in public health and reaches out to millions of people on a regular basis and is highly respected for being just someone who's not caught up in fads, but really understands the importance of evidence and how to really weigh evidence accurately in terms of making the best choices for lifestyle medicine. So we went very deep in lectins, took a lot of other discussions as well on just how we know what is and what isn't so, and also how our diet impacts our world that we're around, the environment. We talked a bit about the clean meat movement, but I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you enjoyed this one as well. And so I give you Dr. David Katz. David, welcome on.
Thanks so much, Alan. Great to be with you.
Hey, yeah, wonderful. So you've written about this topic before, and I wanted to have just a good discussion about all things lectins. You know, what are they? Are they killing us? What do we have to do differently because of that?
All right, that's where we get this party started, huh? So to be honest, despite years of devotion to nutrition and everything important about it, they really had not played a very significant role in anything that I read. You know, they weren't coming up in nutritional epidemiology. They weren't showing up in the basic science literature that I read. Did not seem to be a big deal. And then, of course, kind of out of the blue, we got the plant paradox. Cardiologist writes a book, becomes a bestseller, and basically warns people that a wide swath of the natural food supply contains these complex protein compounds known as lectins, part of a very vast chemical family. And beware, because these things are out to get you. They can glom on to your cells, and they can form complexes with your native proteins, and they can bind with carbohydrates, and they will cause you all sorts of harms. And I thought, wow, that's kind of weird that I knew nothing about that. But even before we talk about the literature on lectins, and the fact that these are compounds that are widely distributed in food. So they're in vegetables, fruits, root vegetables in particular, beans, lentils, nuts, seeds, to some extent, meat, fish, seafood, and dairy too. If you're going to avoid lectins, you're not left with a heck of a lot to eat.
I was going to say, there's certainly some things that higher quantities of certain lectins, but best I could tell, there's really no cells that are devoid of lectins. Is that accurate?
Well, as best I can tell, exactly right. So we can think of them as nearly ubiquitous. But they're concentrated, let's say, in beans and lentils. So if Dr. Gundry was issuing a particular warning about lectins, it translated into eat more meat and beware of beans and lentils and fruits in particular. So I want to address this in two ways. First, at the level of logic. And the simple fact is that we have massive amounts of evidence, you know it well, Alan, that people who eat more legumes, people who eat more fruits and vegetables, people who eat more whole grains, nuts and seeds, all lectin sources, have better health outcomes than people who don't. Period, end of story. I mean, it's a vast amount of literature. It's stunningly consistent. It spans...
Well, and legumes especially. I've seen a lot of data arguing that they may even have gram per gram more benefit than vegetables. They're like just superstars.
Exactly. And in fact, you talk to Dan Buettner, the director of the Blue Zones. Dan wrote a follow-up book, The Blue Zone Solution, and he basically identifies legumes as the common denominator among the very diverse Blue Zone diet. So if you were kind of pulling out, what are the active ingredients in the theme of healthy eating that's associated with 100 years of vital life, legumes are right at the top of that list. And you're also absolutely right at the level of intervention trials and randomized trials and mechanistic studies. So it fails the logic test, and this is a classic case of failing to see the forest for the trees. So what really matters when we talk about foods is the net effect of eating that food. But, if you start dissecting broccoli down to its component molecules, you find potentially carcinogenic compounds and anti-metabolites and things in broccoli that arguably were, if isolated and concentrated, would be bad for health. But that doesn't make broccoli bad for you. It's the net effect of eating broccoli that matters. All plants, by the way, produce these anti-metabolite compounds because they're all busy defending themselves against pests and competing for space and sunlight and rainwater with other plants. So, not everything in a plant is touchy-feely and generated to make humans healthy. But the question is, what's the net effect of eating the food? So everything about the plant paradox and the dialogue about lectins is wrong at the level of what is the net effect of eating these foods. And by the way, nobody eats the beans that are concentrated sources of lectins, like, kidney beans and pinto beans raw. You can't eat them raw. And when you cook them, you denature these lectins and essentially deactivate them. So again, the whole argument is silly. I've compared it in my writing, by the way, Alan, to oxygen and breathing. We both know that oxygen is highly toxic. You expose somebody to 100% oxygen for as little as 2 or 3 days, and you've cooked their lungs, and they're very likely to die. And this is a real problem with people on ventilators in the ICU and people who have various abnormalities of diffusion of oxygen through their lungs, and we're trying to compensate for that. And it's a routine worry in the intensive care unit. How do we avoid oxygen toxicity? But, you apply Dr. Gundry's logic to that and you say the air contains a toxin, therefore stop breathing. It's just foolish. Well, obviously breathing is vastly better for health than not breathing. And similarly, eating beans and lentils and whole grains and fruits and vegetables is vastly better for health than avoiding them. So it fails the logic test. But the other thing is, is he right that there's a literature suggesting that these compounds are causing net harm or are even prone to cause net harm? So I went digging because, again, I really had not come upon a lot of information about lectins before. And what I found was, first of all, a pretty thin literature overall. It's not as if there's a vast literature on lectins. And there are no meaningful intervention trials in people. So, we have no clear outcome data that, people who are assigned to eat more versus fewer lectins, and here's what happens. That doesn't exist. But looking at the basic science that does exist, for every paper I found suggesting that lectins could conceivably be associated with increased health risks, I found 2 or 3 suggesting exactly the opposite, that actually lectins may have the capacity to bind to cancer cells and slow their replication and impede the growth of tumors, potentially facilitate the action of cancer treatments and so forth. So I can't even come away from the literature I found convinced that lectins per se pose a threat. They may actually offer a net health benefit. So this was really a classic example, Alan, of, how do we take advantage of the pathway to a bestseller? And, that answer is pretty obvious. Find a scapegoat. In this case, it was lectins. Offer up a silver bullet. In this case it's, whatever alternative diet Gundry's recommending, or I think he sells supplements. Must be his supplements. Yeah,
Lectin blockers.
So all will be
Lectin
well
blockers.
if you just, reach for your credit card and buy the supplements I'm trying to sell you. So there's a scapegoat, there's a silver bullet, there's a sprinkling of pixie dust, there's a conspiracy theory. Everybody else, is holding back this crucial information from you. I'm not only a renegade genius who's figured out what nobody else knows, but I'm brave enough and bold enough and righteous enough to be the one who's willing to tell you. And that's all baloney, but it's a classic formula for the bestseller lists. And so here we are. So that's the lectin story in the proverbial lectin-containing nutshell.
Lectin-containing nutshell. I wanted to tackle this one because there's certain things people might do that aren't based upon good evidence, but end up being harmless. Like if they decide that they want to raise their plant intake because they want to improve their blood pH. Well, it may not do that, but they're probably going to be healthy by eating more plant foods anyway. But this is a case where the intervention is not harmless. People are actually avoiding the best things they could be consuming.
Exactly. And, my latest book is The Truth About Food. It's a 750-page colossus.
I love it.
And I hasten to note all proceeds from the book go to support federally authorized 501c3, the True Health Initiative. So it really is all about just getting the truth out to the masses. And I have a whole section on lectins. This conversation essentially is in the book. But I also have a whole section. In fact, a reason that the book is 750 pages, because let's face it, the truth about food could be 7 words, and they wouldn't even be my 7 words. They'd be Michael Pollan's 7 words.
Yeah.
Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's pretty much it. So there it is. Thank you. Good night. Book is done. So the reason it's 750 pages, Alan, is because there are a lot of lies about food, and debunking those is hard work and heavy lifting, and there are many pages there. So there is a whole section on this, how you can, first of all, cherry pick the literature to create a false narrative, the formula for producing a bestseller, have a scapegoat, have a silver bullet, offer a magical formula, invoke a conspiracy that nobody else is willing to tell you about. It's really a very well blazed path. And you're absolutely right. There are times, there's a fad that, maybe is talking you into some silly information, and the practice of it won't do you any harm. This is not one of those times. You follow this advice about lectins, and what you say is exactly true. You will be removing from your diet most of the foods most decisively associated with health benefit. And I set the bar for decisive pretty high. I've run a research lab at Yale for 20 years. I've run randomized controlled trials. I've published meta-analyses. I've written a textbook on evidence-based medicine. I don't take that lightly. It's decisive when you have confluence of mechanistic studies showing you, what the effects of foods are. Often these are in cell culture, animal models. You have intervention trials, including double-blind randomized controlled trials showing you attribution, that it really is A that's causing B. And you have large-scale observational studies telling you what happens out in the real world to large populations of people over extended periods of time, like decades, lifetimes, and generations. And what we know about beans and lentils, nuts and seeds, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables is supported by all of that. That's decisive.
I think where people often get confused is that you can hear things that are from mechanistic studies, or even a step down from that are just from hypothesis, like looking at the whole world of biochemistry and all the maps and pathways and speculating if this does this and perhaps this outcome could occur. When people go down to a level that low, you can imagine anything could do anything. And you can make arguments that sound plausible and sound convincing. So
it's not I agree. It's not an unreasonable place to start. Actually, one of the things that I've admired about natural medicine is the attentiveness to the basic science literature, looking for, human need, patient need goes on long after the results of randomized controlled trials run out. That's a simple fact. And one of the reasons, Alan, I spent 15 years running an integrative medicine center and working side by side with my naturopathic colleagues was exactly that. I thought, in our unity was a greater strength. a greater capacity to help more people, or to come up with an answer when the answer was elusive. But that's just the thing. The answer is elusive. And what that means is, if there were an RCT telling you what to do, you would have tried that already. So, it's when you're in that realm where the going really gets tough, you say, okay, what is the next most logical thing to try? What is the next most promising thing to try? And I think, frankly, part of what sets natural medicine apart is, partly it's experience-based, it's empirical. We've done this for patients for years, for generations. They've gotten better. We don't have randomized control trials, but we're convinced by the collective pattern. But I think a lot of the early insights come from basic science. Now, there's a danger there, and you just described it. You can basically look at the basic science literature and come up with an argument that anything can cause anything. You have to really be careful. But I think it's also a reason why, for instance, the natural medicine world was literally decades ahead of the conventional medicine world with regard to omega-3, with regard to coenzyme Q10, with regard to a number of things that ultimately passed the test of rigorous randomized control trials and meta-analyses and so forth. But natural medicine practitioners got there first, and I think it's because of this careful curating of the basic science literature. You have to apply very fine filters, and the other thing you always have to apply when you're going there is the precautionary principle. You really need to be very, very secure that, okay, we're not totally sure that this is going to work as we hope, so we need to be really quite sure about the minimal risk, right? I mean, ultimately, everything in medical decision-making is about the benefit to risk ratio. The less certain you are about the benefit, the more certain you need to be about a very low risk to justify it. And we worked for years in my clinic coming up with quantitative or semi-quantitative approaches to just that decision-making, and actually published a construct we called CARE, Clinical Applications of Research Evidence, where we said, it's not nearly as blunt as people would tend to make it seem, right? I mean, we talk about evidence as if it's yes, no, lights are on, lights are off. We're fully illuminated or in the dark. It's so rarely like that in clinical practice. So we said, no, it's much more subtle. There are 5 domains that matter. There is the efficacy of the treatment. So does it work? Does it not work? How reliably do we know? There's the safety
end of
the
that,
treatment. Is it perfectly safe or potentially quite toxic?
There's not enough evidence.
There's the quality
the
of the evidence related to both safety and efficacy. Are we completely secure in our knowledge or substantially unsure? Are there studies pointing in both directions?
Have you ever seen the BMJ parachute study?
What else is there for this condition? And that's crucial, because if there are a lot of other things for the same condition the patient hasn't yet tried, and some of those are better substantiated and safer, they become a very strong argument not to try the thing you're thinking about. On the other hand, if there's nothing left because the patient's tried everything else and it's failed, that becomes a very strong argument to think seriously about the next most logical thing. And then there's patient preference. So you look across that expanse and say, okay, let's look at the extremes. What if something is unlikely to work, highly toxic? There are many other things that do the job. The evidence is horrible and the patient doesn't particularly want it. Well, that's such an easy no. It's not worth talking about. At the other end of the spectrum, if something is perfectly effective, completely safe, the evidence is fantastic, nothing else does the job, and the patient says, what are you waiting for? That also doesn't require much discussion. It's the stuff in the middle. So what if, well, it looks like it could work, mostly from basic science. People have been exposed to it for maybe hundreds of years, so as best we can tell, it's extremely safe. The evidence is quite murky, but the patient has tried everything that is more substantiated for this condition already, and none of that has worked. And they're saying, doc, please help me. What else have you got? Well, that's a case where you'd say, yeah, the basic science literature may be enough. You'd have to be honest with the patient and say, we don't know for sure that this is effective, but it makes sense to try it next. And that's the model we practiced for those 15 years.
That's great. And a super important point you made in there was in the absence of other evidence. And that's the difference. So when someone is speculating about chemical pathways in without reviewing the fact there are larger studies suggesting otherwise, that's when you can go any direction and end up completely wrong. Yeah.
And so to close the circle and bring this back to lectins, exactly. So if we had never had a shred of evidence about, what does it do to human health over a lifetime to eat beans and lentils and whole grains and fruits and vegetables, and, somebody discovered lectins and their potential to be antimetabolites, that would really be worth exploring. But in the context of, wait a minute, we already know what happens when people eat these foods. So this is so obviously a boondoggle. I mean, how can you find this little bit of subsidiary evidence, which, by the way, is, again, a very thin thread in the biomedical literature, and by no means decisively in one direction. As I say, I think there are more studies suggesting benefit from lectins. Dr. Gundry carefully avoided citing those to make his case. But it's, this is such a tiny sliver in a vast fabric of literature all about the net effect of foods and dietary patterns. Yeah, I mean, talk about letting the tail wag the dog. This is the most extreme, absurd case I think I've ever seen.
The opposite end of that, where natural medicine can do well to speculate when there's not enough evidence, the conventional model can oftentimes be just paralyzed and not be willing to look at anecdotal things or plausible ideas in the absence of higher evidence. Have you ever seen the BMJ parachute study?
Yes, well, exactly, and I've talked a lot in my own writing about the parable of the tiny parachute. Yeah, totally agree. So there are lifestyle medicine studies, Alan, that basically, can we use a lifestyle intervention to improve weight or diabetes in primary care? And you read some of these studies, and it's we counseled patients on a healthy diet for 3 minutes once every 8 years, and it didn't work. Therefore, lifestyle medicine doesn't work. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but kind of along those lines. I'm thinking,
right.
Come on, it's like a study. You randomly assign people to jump out of a plane with no parachute,
right.
or a parachute the size of a postage stamp, and you reach the conclusion that parachutes don't work. Well, no, your parachutes just weren't very good parachutes. Yeah. So
they also had one that was called the parachute study.
But we don't need
a
microscope or a telescope to reach out and take hold of the apple in the kitchen.
This was basically against the idea of making recommendations
similarly,
in the absence of
an RCT is a tool.
Evidence. And it was this satirical paper written arguing that we really don't have any good RCTs with efficacies of parachutes for preventing trauma from rapid deceleration post-airplane exiting at high elevation. And basically...
Yes, okay. I remember seeing that. Yeah, exactly. And by the way, we have no randomized controlled trials that compare water to gasoline for putting out campfires. We have no randomized controlled trials that compare intervening to passive observation for gunshot wounds to the chest. Not on and on it goes, right? And yes, exactly. And so
right.
And again, I say this, and we obviously share a passion for this topic, but I say this as somebody who taught biostatistics at the Yale School of Medicine for a decade, written textbooks on clinical epidemiology, sort of a card-carrying member of the evidence-based medicine club. I am saying, along with you, beware the tyranny of the randomized control trial, because there is so much we know about how the world works that is totally uninformed by RCTs. I just participated a few weeks ago in a debate in New York about the health benefits of plant-based diets, and I'll spare you. I won the debate.
Oh, wow.
I'll spare you all the gory details, but in order to be sure that I would win the debate about the volume and quality of evidence, I cited a lot of RCTs and meta-analyses and systematic reviews. But only after doing all of that, I said to my audience, here's an apple. And I had an apple. And, I want to ask you, can you know something? Not believe it or hope or wish, but know something in the absence of evidence? Or do you need evidence to know? And they pretty much all agreed you need evidence to know. And I then asked them, and to know with nearly complete certainty, would you agree that you need quite rigorous evidence? And pretty much everybody agreed. And I said, okay, well, with what level of certainty do you know that if I throw this apple in the air, it's going to fall back down rather than float away? Be honest. And, I don't know if they were honest, but some hands went up. And I threw the apple in the air.
Of course it will, yeah.
And while the apple was falling back down and not floating away, because that's what it did, said, now tell me, when's the last time you read a randomized controlled trial about apple tossing? Or saw a meta-analysis on the effects of throwing an apple in the air. So, so much of what we know is so obvious. And we've actually started to abuse science itself. Unfortunately, everything people get their hands on, succumbs to balkanization and dogma. And we've now started to corrupt science. Science is the most powerful means ever devised to answer questions that our native perceptions can't answer. It's the ultimate extender. A microscope lets us see what our eyes can't see. A telescope lets us reach out into the cosmos. But we don't need a microscope or a telescope to reach out and take hold of the apple in the kitchen. And, similarly, an RCT is a tool. It's designed to populate gaps in our knowledge. It serves a specific purpose. But if you start to attach dogma to it and make claims like the only thing you can ever know comes from an RCT, you've corrupted the tool and you start to propagate confusion. And actually this applied to nutrition is a major part of my vocation these days in all that I do, Alan, in academia and research, in writing, in journalism, and in my private sector activities. This is the huge problem of our time with regard to nutrition. We've actually got more science every day, and yet have managed to unlearn what we know before we ever even invented science. And back to my book for a second. So the title is The Truth About Food, but the subtitle is Why Pandas Eat Bamboo and People Get Bamboozled. Yeah, and so the idea there is, how is it that we, Homo sapiens, with these great big Homo sapien brains, can be the one species of animal that has absolutely no clue what it ought to eat? Every wild animal species on the planet knows what to eat.
So we've got certain domains of knowledge that seem to be just ripe for this. That we get conflicts, we get biases, we get incentives or whatnot. So why do you think that food and nutrition have succumbed to this? That they're one of those domains?
So it's an excellent question, and I think there are lots of answers. Let's start with money. It's a huge swath of our economy, and I think if there weren't vast sums of money to be made, and there weren't whole industries running on pseudo-confusion about food, this would be a much lesser problem. So let's face it, big food makes tons of money by making us fat and sick, and they get cover by all the pseudo-confusion about diet. I mean, if everybody agreed with absolute conviction about what's good, what's not good, it would be much harder to sell what's not good. But if you can stoke the flames of dogma and dissent so that it seems like no two experts agree, well, then you can pretty much sell people anything, right? I mean, I think that makes perfectly good sense. And I think that's breakfast in America, business as usual. And frankly, big food goes further than just selling us junk. They sell us willfully addictive junk. And this has been beautifully chronicled by Michael Moss recently, or fairly recently, in his book Salt, Sugar, Fat, and in the derivative New York Times Magazine cover story, The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. So, in a nutshell, every big food company has teams of PhDs that get a functional MRI machine and marching orders to design food that makes the appetite center in the human hypothalamus light up like a Christmas tree, so people don't stop eating until their arm gets tired from lifting food to their mouths. And it was a threat.
But exactly. You can't eat just one.
They really meant business when they said that. And it wasn't just Lay's potato chips. It's pretty much every highly processed food in the food supply. And by the way, we have an additional element to that argument now, courtesy of Kevin Hall at the NIH, with a recent study showing that if you pretty much match everything else, ultra processing all by itself induces overeating. This was a recent metabolic ward study, a randomized trial. So it really elevated the whole discussion. And then we've got big pharma, which produces massive profits, mostly by treating diseases people never needed to get in the first place. The most lucrative drugs are for treating coronary disease and diabetes. And most of the diabetes is type 2, and almost none of that needs to happen. And the coronary disease is mostly related to modifiable risk factors. Almost none of that needs to happen. We know for sure that 90% of type 2 diabetes is outright preventable, probably more of it. We know for sure that 80% of all coronary disease is outright preventable, probably more of it. Some of my colleagues have argued it's an eradicable disease like smallpox. Nobody needs to get it. But everybody in the United States gets it. It's a rite of passage. You reach a certain age, if you don't have a stent or a cabbage scar, you're an outlier. Well, I mean, massive sums of money are being made there. And then there's big media. Diet is a complex variable. There are infinite things you can say about it. It's much more complex than physical activity, much more complex than sleep. I mean, you can talk about sleep quality and quantity, but it's a short conversation. Diet, I mean, there's so many different ways to put it together. So it's an infinite conversation. And if your audience is perpetually confused, well, then, you can tell them something different every week, maybe every day, and have them tune in tomorrow to get another dose of, sort of the latest version of confusion. And just keep everybody disequilibrated. And, there's just constant fascination because people experience the effects of diet in their lives in real time. Their weight, for example, they see it. They want to do something about it. And so, fantastic media topic. And then big publishing. I mean, how many fad diet books have been published in the United States in the past 30 years? It's got to be thousands. And many of them made bestseller lists, tons and tons of money. But if ever the public gets a clue about diet and stops waiting to learn what to eat in the next fad diet book, that profit line shuts down. So there's all of that. And then there's the simple fact that almost everybody eats almost every day. It's a ubiquitous exposure. It's a part of our daily lives. You can't think of other topics we talk about nearly as much. And one good example is the weather. Right? I mean, the weather is a hot topic on local news. Everybody's looking at it, wants to know. We get all worked up about big storms. I would say there's almost as much passion about weather as there is about food because both affect us every day. They affect our quality of life every day. So you've got a captive audience. If you're talking weather, and that's why so many weathermen become famous celebrities because they're talking about a topic that's of constant interest to just about everybody. Well, food is the same way. And so, it's a perfect storm. I mean, I could keep going, but that's a partial answer to your question. Why does this pertain so specifically to food? Enormously complex variable, infinite ways to put diets together, therefore infinite ways to talk about putting diets together, and vast sums of money to be made from perpetuating pseudo confusion about diet and health.
And we can't, like you said, we can't really opt out. You can't really just choose to not eat and do nothing. And there's so many levels by which this also relates to our sense of security, our connections, the love that we receive. There's all these elements to it as well.
And you maybe have high
and then there's
blood
also
pressure.
the difficulty in just perceiving how our immediate short-term interventions are playing out towards our long-term health.
Extremely restrictive, you'll lose weight. Because most Americans are starting out on the seafood diet.
So a lot of ways can make it ambiguous for the consumer.
You raise another important point, and that's temporality. And another topic that really resonates with me, and I've learned about this reading anthropology literature, is how our brains are hardwired for the savannah. And so we perceive risk, benefit, threats, crises. Best when they come at us in spans of seconds or minutes, maybe hours. Days is already pushing it. But the threats in the modern world, it's not nature red in tooth and claw. It's not fight or flight. It's, coronary atherosclerosis developing over a span of years and decades, or carcinogenesis developing through a sequence over years and decades.
That's back to temporality.
It really is the fact that we have so much difficulty seeing cause and effect outside of our native time horizons that makes it hard for us to say, these are the threats of the savannah in the modern world. These are the teeth and the claws coming for us. They're just coming in slow motion, but it's the same exact thing. So that's a huge issue.
Well, and there's also ways by which people can go on a fad diet and maybe they're doing a couple of steps that are very counterproductive, but perhaps they've also just lowered their total food volume for a while. And maybe they've decreased the amount of processed food for a little bit. So maybe they've taken, a couple of steps forward and 5 steps back. And at first, they may see some gains for lasting
health.
And that can make it especially confusing.
Well, that's a really important issue right now because, here we are at a time where we've never had more decisive, more voluminous evidence indicating that Michael Pollan was right. We need to eat less processed food and our diets need to be plant predominant. We also have never had anything near so much evidence regarding the impact of dietary pattern on the planet. So we're having this conversation not long after the release of the Eat Lancet Commission report on diet for the health of people and planet alike. We've had UN reports on accelerating extinction and the threat to biodiversity. We all know about the extreme peril of climate change. And, we've heard quite decisively from multiple sources that animal agriculture, the production of beef in particular, makes a massive contribution to greenhouse gas, makes a massive contribution to the desiccation of aquifers. So the confluence of public and planetary health is arguing mightily for a shift toward more plant foods. And let's forget about lectins because that was sort of a minor argument, but we've got the most popular diet of the day going in exactly the opposite direction, and that's the ketogenic diet. Yeah. And everything you just said is exactly right about the ketogenic diet. So, if you are very overweight and you have insulin resistance and you have dyslipidemia and you maybe have high blood pressure, and if you go on a diet that's extremely restrictive, any diet that's extremely restrictive, you'll lose weight. Because, most Americans are starting out on the seafood diet. Namely, I see food and I eat it. So, you go from I eat anything I see to I've got some rules I need to follow. You're massively better off in terms of controlling your total energy intake. And so you'll lose weight. And then in the short term, just losing weight makes everything else look better. So if you're overweight, you lose weight, your glycohemoglobin comes down. If you're overweight and lose weight, your insulin comes down. If you're overweight and lose weight, your lipids come down, right? But what I routinely point out to people is, but if you're overweight and lose weight because you go on a cocaine binge, all those same things will happen. If you're overweight and lose weight because you get cholera, all of those same things will happen. Somewhere we surrendered sense and adopted the notion that short-term outcomes are commensurate with long-term health goals, but they're not. You can do things in the short.
That's back to the temporality again. People are that's all they're really seeing.
And so the goal in my space, lifestyle medicine, is years in life in years. And sure, if you need to lose weight in the short term, that's part of it. And if you need to fix your lipids or your glycohemoglobin in the short term, part of it. If you need to reduce inflammatory cytokines, all part of it. But what we want to do is approach those things in a way that doesn't just work as a quick fix, but is a lasting solution, most likely to add years to your life, add life to your years. And by the way, it ought to be good for the planet too. So here we are knowing how to do that. And the popular diet of our day is a diet telling people to do the exact opposite of what we know to be good for lasting health and what we know to be crucial for the planet. I think that's just tragic. And, I think you captured it well. Yes, you can do almost any fad diet approach, almost any squirrely thing, and you can derive some short-term benefit at the expense of long-term. And if you only ever focus on the short-term, you sort of take this myopic view of health, what you'll get caught up in is an endless sequence of those. So, you'll take 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, and abandon ship. And then, a couple months later, you'll be desperate to try something new. You'll do much the same thing again. And I'm sure you've seen the same. I had many patients over the years. That was their life, on and off. These destined to fail short-term quick fixes for a lifelong struggle.
And part of the psychology is often that it's harder to see that the 2 steps forward came from anything other than the steps you took, that they were inadvertent. And so the mindset is often then to double down. So if someone went paleo and thought they were better at first, but it didn't last on them, then they often double down and say, now I've got to go lectins. Or if they went low carb and did better at first, but didn't last, then they've got to go keto.
Right. Exactly right. And when in fact, it's the common denominator to all of these that is producing the short-term benefit. Namely, you went from behavior that had no boundaries, no parameters, no rules, no discipline to a set of rules, and any set of rules, any adversity would have produced the same outcome. And again, if what you're doing is producing the same net effect as a bout of cholera or cocaine binge, it is definitely a reason to pause and say, okay, I really do need to know, is this good for me in the long term? But by the way, we left a thread dangling. I just want to quickly circle back because you made a good point.
Please.
It was quite a while ago in the conversation, but you were saying, we were talking about basic science, and I was saying how much I appreciate that, natural medicine, looks at that space and finds opportunity there well ahead of conventional medicine. We both agree, though, that the critical issue is separating baby from bathwater. You can't be unduly exuberant about, sort of the early hints in the basic science literature. But you mentioned, conventional medicine is often too closed-minded. And so, we'll simply say, we don't have a randomized controlled trial, therefore we're out of options.
Therefore, we can say nothing.
I'm not going to help you. And I agree with you. I think the problem exists in both directions. I think the subtle challenge of good clinical medicine is navigating between those two. Let's call them Scylla and Charybdis, and safely navigating that channel. And it's not easy, and you really have to be careful. But I've sort of referred to it over the years about being completely responsible about the use of scientific evidence, but fully committed to being responsive to the needs of patients that go on when the evidence starts to run very thin. And I really like that comment you made, and I completely agree with you. There's peril in either direction. And it's the rare clinician who, is really devoted to navigating that middle channel.
Another way of thinking about that is with a hierarchy of evidence. Many of the listeners may not have seen these. You've seen these images where it will show a pyramid, and the pinnacle of that pyramid is things like the meta-analysis of combined randomized controlled trials, and the bottom of that might be sheer hypothesis. I've called this the failure to look up or the failure to look down. So I'd argue that natural medicine can do a lot in the world of hypothesis and speculation and perhaps test tube studies, but may not look up and see if there's better evidence that's contradictory. And then the conventional model may put a lot of focus on things at that pinnacle, but may fail to look down and see, in the absence of data, are there good things at lower levels?
I completely agree. And I think there's actually even more subtlety to this space. And this relates to a project very near and dear to my heart. So I've been working with colleagues for almost 2 years on a project we called HELM, Hierarchies of Evidence, so directly germane to what you just mentioned. Hierarchies of Evidence applied to lifestyle medicine, and delighted to report that with fairly minor revisions, the paper was accepted to BMC medical research methodology. And we're finally finalizing those revisions now. We did a methodologic systematic review, and what we were looking at was strength of evidence tools. So this very issue of, what is the hierarchy of evidence? And what we said was, for the things that matter most in lifestyle medicine, an RCT will never answer the question. We really do care about vitality overall, and we care about longevity, years in life and life in years. You're not going to do a randomized controlled trial that's going to tell you about effects over a 50-year span, an 80-year span, a 100-year span. Never going to be done, right? Let alone, what happens over generations. You look at ethnography.
You can't clone people and repeat an experiment.
Exactly. And not to mention all the researchers will be long dead before the study's ever over. I mean, they're going to have their progeny, take up the charge. But, the experience in the blue zones is not just about people living to 100 today. It's about an intergenerational experience. You're never going to get that information from an RCT. So in our project, what we talked about is the specific contribution different types of research make to understanding. And really the goals of science overall are truth and understanding. It's not more RCTs, it's not more meta-analyses. Those are just means to an end. The end is understanding what's true. So how do we understand what's true? Well, if the questions are, what makes the greatest contribution to years in life and life in years, we can think about it in terms of at least 3 distinct sources of information. Basic science, in all of its many flavors, contributes mechanism. It tells us whether or not something can work, and if so, how. That's important because if something can't work, there isn't much point in doing longer-term interventions. If there's absolutely no mechanistic link between A and B, then studying those connections doesn't make a lot of sense. But it can tell you a lot about potential. And so you've got mechanism there. Intervention studies, including randomized controlled trials, are extremely useful for attribution. What they really contribute is, okay, both A and B happened. Can we be reasonably confident that A caused B? Because we ran this study in such a way where that was really the only difference between the two groups. One group got A, the other group didn't get A, and we looked at how much B developed. But we controlled everything else so that the extra B in the group that got A caused that. We're really quite confident. So attribution. but it tells you generally nothing about, lifelong effects. And so there, you absolutely need observational epidemiology. And I think when you start to think about, what kind of information do you get from different kinds of research, you start to process it in a much more artful manner. So in our paper, we actually make the case for a concept we called evidence threshold pathway mapping. And you can almost think about this as sort of like clearing a high bar. Maybe there are multiple different ways to get up and over. And so, maybe there are very few RCTs, but really strong observational evidence and a few good mechanistic studies. Or maybe there's slam dunk mechanistic research and absolutely slam dunk observational epidemiology and no RCTs, but you still are really, really confident. Or it's a different mix where, okay, lesser observational epidemiology, but, a couple of long-term big studies that are suggestive, but really strong RCTs about the attribution. And our point was, we created these different assemblies so we could reach the same high level of confidence, the same strong level of evidence along different routes. And we kind of mapped out those routes. Yeah. So that'll be, again, we'll get these revisions done. We'll get this paper published soon. And then we hope it's a really significant advance, and a major contribution to this dialogue about evidence, because those evidence hierarchies are useful. As you point out, again, I think we sometimes have failure to kind of look up and down and really make sense of them. But the simple fact is the relevant assemblies of evidence that serve the ultimate purpose, which is understanding what's true, vary significantly with the particular question we're asking. And the last thing I would append there, Alan, is that the question we're asking in the first place issues from sense, not science. Science is a powerful means for for answering questions. But whether we ask good or bad questions in the first place derives from sense. And that's another one of the false narratives these days. We tend to talk about science as if it's independent of sense. They absolutely need one another.
Yeah. Yeah, knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah, another way of thinking about it.
One thing I'd like to just open up briefly, talking about the confluence of environmental needs and dietary needs. Have you followed the whole clean meat movement? And if so, have you got thoughts about that?
Yes, I do. So, there are lots of variations on this theme these days because, there's sort of mixed use agriculture and, and the idea that we can derive optimal benefit from the acreage we commit to agriculture if we do mixed use agriculture, if we graze, feed animals and raise meat in places that may not be great for growing crops. And it's certainly true that there are some patches of land where you can graze animals where it would be really difficult to grow food crops directly for people. There's also the idea that, in doing that, you're letting animals eat their sort of native variety of plants. They're getting exercise and so forth. There's the general issue of grass-fed versus grain-fed and all of that. Then there's also, of course, the derivative discussion about synthesized meat, alternatives to meat, right?
That's what I was referring to.
Yeah, so it extends into the realm of sort of, meat that was not grown on the hoof, but rather grown in the lab. So, there are all sorts of issues here. Let's start at a very high level and then work down. At a very high level, we eat way too much meat as a species. And one way or another, we have to slash our intake massively. And this was the conclusion in the Eat Lancet report where, they looked specifically at best numbers regarding greenhouse gas emissions, water utilization, land use, biodiversity, et cetera, and sort of mapped everything out in terms of, what level of intake for a population of 8 billion now and projected to be 10 billion at some point in the not too distant future, unless we get global population under control, what's sustainable. And they literally map this in the report, relative to how much the Earth can tolerate. And their conclusion was that relative to prevailing intake levels in much of the modern world now, we need to reduce meat intake by 90%. That's huge. That's huge. And that's wow. Just to stay within sustainable boundaries for, pretty ominous thresholds where, if you cross the line, every year using more resources than the earth can produce. So, you're eating your children's food basically, and you're drinking your children's water. So pretty serious stuff. So one way or another, we're obligated to massively reduce our intake of meat. One way to keep producing some meat would be mixed use agriculture. I've heard various opinions about that. It's a subtle topic, but I think there's potentially a there, but that has to fall within the 90% reduction. And then there is alternatives to meat. So if we want to call that clean meat or synthetic meat or vegan meat, it's potentially all of those different things depending on which company's making it. I think there are two unanswered questions. The first is, what is the health effect of that food? And since these foods are all pretty darn new, I don't think we know. I certainly don't feel confident that I know. And the second is, what is the net environmental impact? Because, okay, yes, it's not meat production, but there's a factory involved very often, right? There's scientists and labs, and that means equipment is running, electricity is being used, transportation is happening, there's an assembly line. And what is the carbon footprint of all of that? And how much water is utilized in all of that? And, it may be that the answers to those questions are good answers, that it's that it's carbon neutral, or it's minimal, or, it's a massive improvement over meat production. But, this is where the law of unintended consequences has to be considered, right? So that, the goal here would be to reduce meat consumption, but instead of doing it in the obvious way we know would be beneficial, namely, everybody starts eating more beans and lentils instead of meat, we do it in the, hey, let's find a whole new way to make a lot of money method that's native to Homo sapiens, and let's invent all kinds of new stuff. We don't necessarily need it, but let's do it and create a market for it. And well, then what are the unintended consequences? Is it conceivable that the factories involved in making synthetic meat generate more greenhouse gases than raising cattle? At scale, I guess it's possible. We sure don't want that to happen. I don't know those answers. I'm starting to confer with people who do. We're doing a project right now, if I may digress a little bit from this topic. It's a good question, and it's important. Let me say two things. So one of my activities these days is, and one about which I have a great deal of passion, is running a company I founded called Diet ID. We have, for the first time in our lifetimes, reinvented dietary assessment and tracking so it can be done in seconds. In less than a minute, we could tell you your dietary pattern, your objectively measured diet quality, estimate up to 150 different nutrient levels you're getting from food. And we're deploying this in a number of clinical settings, and it works like a trip to the eye doctor.
How does that work?
So if you go to the eye doctor, you do not bring with you a lengthy questionnaire you filled out describing how you think you see in different kinds of light at different times of day. You look into a device called a phoropter. We've all done this. And you see two images, and one is clear and one is blurry, and you have to say which one is clear. And then after you pick, you have to pick again. How about now? And how about now? And within about 30 seconds, there is an exact match for your eyes in corrective diopters. So we've done the same thing for diet. So rather than ask people to, describe, how many times did you eat pasta sauce in the last 6 months? And by the way, how much? And, essentially all the approaches to dietary intake assessment ask you to build up a representation of your diet, one food meal day at a time. We've reverse engineered that. So we've said all of that leads to some finite array of real world dietary patterns. Let's take a look at the epidemiology. Yeah. What are the real world dietary patterns in the United States? Let's map them. Let's capture at least those that represent about 95% of everybody. Let's then stratify all of them by objective tiers of quality using the Healthy Eating Index 2015.
Wouldn't grow as well.
And for every cell in that map, let's create a full 3-day meal plan and turn that into an image. And then let's take that image and reduce it to the bare minimum that would fit on a smartphone screen, so that there's basically a pictorial representation of a specific diet type at a specific quality tier. And we show you 2 at a time that are relevant to you. We need to ask you a couple of questions first to know which ones to show you, but there's no heavy lifting. And then we say, okay, which of these 2 looks more like stuff you usually eat? And you pick, and we say, okay, how about now? Yeah. It's exactly like the phoropter. Within about 30 to 60 seconds, we've got a very close correspondence to your dietary pattern. We've actually validated this against the food frequency questionnaire. I was just editing that manuscript earlier today. We have a trial just about to get started against biomarkers. The dang thing works, and it's incredibly easy. It's cool, right? So this is, people want to learn more about this. They can visit dietid.com. We think this is
we'll get that in the show notes.
Okay, great. We think this is a really big advance. But here's the cool thing. So, we designed this mostly and initially, we're working with nutrition experts, leading nutrition experts. It was all focused on improving diet for health and in various contexts. But we realized pretty early in the process that, if you map diets this way, so you've got, essentially two axes, diet type, diet quality, you're starting to look at a gradient in environmental footprint too. And if we could get our arms around that, if we could think in terms of, the best way to capture the overall environmental footprint of diet, we could use this intellectual property to create an app that can coach anybody to minimize the environmental footprint of their diet and actually show them the quantitative changes they're making with each step. So we're working on that. So the True Health Initiative has convened a group of world-leading experts in environmental impact of diet to help get that metric formed and out in the public domain. And then we'll use it at Diet ID to create this app. And we expect to have that available within roughly a year.
That's great. And yeah, the listeners, that'll be in the show notes. We'll have links to that, and we'll keep everyone updated about that as it goes also.
Anyway, so that is where I'm kind of having the deepest dive into questions just like the one you raised, Alan. So what about clean meat and meat substitutes and synthetic meat? And these super smart experts who, spent their whole careers working on environmental impact of foods, people like Guidon Echelle at Harvard, and who've applied rigorous quantitative methods. Every time we think we have an answer, they say, hang on a second. And then there's this whole series of questions, like, for example, locally sourcing food. I mean, we all think that's a good thing. But these experts say, well, actually sometimes the economies of scale for producing a food in a place where it's produced with extreme efficiency plus transportation produces a lesser cost in water use and greenhouse gas emission than growing it locally in a place that is less able to produce it with high efficiency. Well. And similarly, the idea of producing alternatives to meat, it seems like it's obviously a good thing unless, you've got intensive factory methods, and then it's conceivable it could be a lateral move or even a backward move. So, nothing is as simple as it seems. Clearly, human ingenuity is up to the task of sorting this out and making the right decisions. But I only know enough in this space to know that I should listen to the experts. And what the experts tell me is the answers are far more subtle than we wish they were. Yeah.
This has been incredible and great stuff. A lot of directions that wasn't even expecting. And yeah, super appreciated. I love just the synopsis about the fact that these questions are important, but they're by and large things that have answers. What you're saying is that these aren't things people have to be puzzling over.
Human ingenuity is remarkable. We really do have extraordinary brains. We just have to be willing to get out of our own way. I do think the single greatest threat to advancing the human condition, preserving this magnificent planet, is not want of information. It's active misinformation, and it's dogma, and it's tribalism, where we'd rather argue with one another than acknowledge the common ground. I created the True Health Initiative because there is so much common ground. We want to expose that. We want the public to know. If we only use, and this set my career in motion. I finished my second residency in preventive medicine in 1993. That was the year, Alan, that Bill Foege and Mike McGinnis published in JAMA Actual Causes of Death in the United States, and made it perfectly clear that if we simply addressed modifiable risk factors we fully knew about a quarter century ago, we could eliminate 80% of all premature death and chronic disease in the modern world. That was true 26 years ago. It's that much truer now. And all of those same things are true about protecting the planet as well. So yeah, this is a job we can do, but we have to be willing to share information civilly with one another. We have to be able to disagree about some details while acknowledging there's still plenty of room on common ground for common cause. And then the sky's the limit.
Well, and we have to agree upon just the validity of information and evidence and the need for verified data.
And the fact that these days, everybody's online, it's so easy to go shopping for the opinion you already own. And when you find it, say, Eureka, I was right, as opposed to doing the hard work of shopping for alternatives to the opinion you already own and seeing, are these well argued? Do these make sense? Should I temper my view? We all have to be humbler about evidence. It isn't true just because we wish it were. And again, I think the journey toward common cause on common ground requires that kind of humility. It doesn't count, folks, as research to go shopping for the opinion you already own. It really doesn't. The hard job of research is to suppress our biases and go looking for evidence that competes with what we wish were true. And, is it important? For example, what's going on with vaccines now, right? People, no matter how much evidence there is about the benefits of vaccines, the people who oppose them are just dug in and unwilling to listen. We have to be willing to suppress our bias, and come together and rally around fundamental truths. And sometimes they'll be what they wish they were, and sometimes they won't. But again, the real pursuit of our collective best destiny requires honoring truth as we find it, rather than torquing it to fit our preconceived notions. Confirmation bias, right? It can only be true if it lines up with what I believed yesterday. We're never going to get where we want to go if we all think like that.
It's funny, we talk about things being evidence-based, and I've actually talked to my doctors about that. And I think all too often people can have whatever view and find evidence to base their view on or to support their view. And I talk about being evidence-led, and exactly what you're describing is letting the facts take you where they need to.
It's about the weight of evidence. It's about using science right. It's about interpreting science with sense. And it is about acknowledging consensus too. If thousands of studies agree and one disagrees, the one is likely to be wrong. Every now and then it's a revelation, but mostly it's just wrong. And if thousands of very well-informed scientists agree and one comes along to tell us that lectins are now committing crimes against humanity, chances are that, that squirrely new theory is wrong, and it's just about selling us something. And I think that's the other critical thing. We have to grow up. Mature, responsible adults take things like their money and their raising their children and education and their job seriously. Those same mature, responsible adults hear a get thin quick scheme and they go into a trance and start reaching for their credit cards. We have to start treating health with at least the respect our society pays to wealth, because frankly, there is no wealth of any kind that really matters in the absence of health.
So awesome stuff. Dr. David Katz, thank you for your time. Everyone, I highly recommend just his work in general. The book you mentioned, The Truth About Food, Why Pandas Eat Bamboo and Why People Get Bamboozled, one of my favorites. I've read that word for word. I'll get links in the show notes and links to the other things we've mentioned. So yeah, really appreciate it.
It's been great, Alan. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your good work.
All right. Those out there, thanks for joining us here, and I'll be back with you again real soon. Take great care. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christensen here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christensen on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.